Okay, before we jump back into salmonella, one thing that I forgot to mention when we talked about food poisoning prior to this, and I mentioned this a little bit when we talked again about like the danger zone stuff. So it's very important to keep in mind, if you have food that's sitting out for a little while, and the bacteria is kind of, inside of it growing and producing toxins, okay? If you take that food, put it in the fridge, and then let it sit overnight or whatever, and then you cook it, all right? Remember that cooking the food will kill the bacteria, but it won't do anything about the toxins, okay? So you can still get food poisoning from food that's been cooked properly, but it wasn't handled properly previously. So if the food was sitting out for a while and the bacteria was allowed to grow and create toxins, then it's still going to make you sick because the cooking process will only kill the bacterial cells. It won't destroy the toxin. So that's another thing, to keep in mind is not only do you want to make sure food is cooked properly, you want to make sure it's being handled properly. Okay, back to salmonella. Um, so I'm sure you've all heard of salmonella before. You've heard of, you probably think of things like eggs, maybe like animal feces, that kind of thing. The other thing to keep in mind too is with pet reptiles, because I have a pet turtle, and turtles and lizards and snakes, they will often have salmonella that lives on their skin the same way that we have like staph that lives on our skin. So the salmonella lives on them and it doesn't hurt them. It's just kind of living its life. But if you were to handle a pet reptile and then eat some food without washing your hands, you could potentially get a salmonella infection from that. So it's very important, and especially with little kids. Like if they touch a snake or touch a turtle or something like that, you want to make sure they wash their hands before they eat because you don't want to get any of that salmonella inside of you. Okay. So like I said, humans, most animals have natural populations of salmonella living inside of them. They can potentially turn pathogenic kind of randomly at any time. And then, of course, you can also get an infection from infected meat, eggs, raw vegetables, okay? Because with raw vegetables, what can happen is if raw vegetables are contaminated by some sort of animal feces, like a cow or a goat or something like that, then if you don't wash it really really thoroughly, and you don't cook it, then you can get sick from that. All right, so then another species of salmonella is called Salmonella typhi, and Salmonella typhi causes a disease called typhoid fever. So typhoid fever is a different thing than Salmonella gastroenteritis. Okay, this is an actual different disease caused by a very different species of Salmonella. High fever, headache, diarrhea, intestinal ulcers. So of course, it starts off and then just gets worse, worse, and worse. The ulcers can actually cause intestinal perforation, which can lead to peritonitis and death. I'm not going to tell you the story of Typhoid Mary, okay? It should be, I don't know, honestly, if it's even in your book anymore, because sometimes, let's see. Yes, so your book mentions it on page 716. It's just like one little paragraph, okay? So if you want to read about Typhoid Mary, because a lot of times people have heard that term, they're like, oh, Typhoid Mary, but you don't know what it is, okay? So just read that paragraph in your book. It talks about typhoid, talks about Typhoid Mary, and how Typhoid Mary caused like these horrible outbreaks of typhoid and all that. Um, and even when you recover from the disease, you will continue to shed the salmonella bacteria in your feces for many months afterwards. So it can potentially cause, and you don't hear about a lot nowadays because our water is so clean and we're so careful with our food and we're so careful with things and all that. So you don't hear a lot about typhoid fever anymore. 100 years ago, it was a big time danger, because people were drinking contaminated water, they were consuming contaminated food. But yeah, you can read a little bit more about it in your book. Certainly for the test, you just need to know Salmonella typhi causes typhoid fever. Typhoid fever, it's it has diarrhea, it has intestinal stuff, but it's also other things going on, and it is certainly potentially a very dangerous disease. Okay, next is cholera. So cholera is actually one of the bigger topics for us in this chapter. And normally what I would do is I would play a series of videos about cholera. Now, obviously, we're not meeting face-to-face for class anymore, so it is up to you to watch those videos. Those videos are posted to D2L. It will be important for the last exam for you to watch those videos, okay? So make sure you watch those videos. They're not terribly long, okay? They're really, really fascinating, especially nowadays with the stuff going on with coronavirus. It is, of course, a very different disease. It was a different time, different place, but just, watch those cholera videos. It's very interesting. We can discuss it before the last test in a couple weeks. We can discuss it, we can do all that, but make sure you watch those videos about cholera. It's very important. Okay, so cholera is a very serious, very dangerous digestive disease. It's caused by a gram-negative bacteria called Vibrio cholerae. So cholera toxin is one of the most potent, dangerous bacterial toxins that we know of. Not only does it cause cells to actively secrete water, it also causes our cells to lose electrolytes. So when your cells are basically being forced to lose water and electrolytes, that results in very, very severe dehydration, from severe diarrhea and severe vomiting. Okay, so cholera is characterized by very, very horrible diarrhea, horrible vomiting, which leads to dehydration so severe that it kills you. The only thing that can be done about cholera is supportive care. Because it's a toxin, it's not the actual bacteria, okay? So you can't give people with cholera, you can't give them antibiotics, because antibiotics are just going to kill the bacteria, which causes more toxin to be released. So the thing about cholera is your body just has to survive it. Your body has to just flush itself of that toxin, get the toxin out of there, and in order to not die, you have to be hooked up to an IV, often, 2 or 3 IVs, and they just need to, pump you with, with fluids to keep you from dehydrating to death. It's spread via contaminated water. The other thing that's really crazy about cholera is it can actually live in salt water and in fresh water. Most bacteria, it's either or. Most bacteria, they either like the salt water or they like the fresh water. The bacteria that causes cholera lives in both. And of course, the major way to prevent the disease is through effective sewage treatment and water cleaning treatment. So making sure that you have water that's free of any and all fecal material, raw sewage, and bacterial contamination. So the other thing about cholera is oftentimes you will see cholera outbreaks after some ecological disasters. So after like a hurricane or a severe flood or a severe earthquake. This actually happened in Haiti when the really bad earthquake happened there. Is anytime that your clean water is harmed, or you don't have access to clean water anymore, the water that's available could potentially be contaminated by fecal material. That's when you have to worry about cholera, and cholera outbreaks still happen to this day. And it's a horrible, awful disease. And again, there really isn't a cure. You just have to keep the person alive long enough for their body to fight it off. There's other Vibrio species that will cause wound infections, other gastrointestinal diseases, but cholera is by far the worst Vibrio disease. Um, so again, make sure you watch those videos, a little bit about the history of cholera, and just understand that this is still a disease that happens, especially anytime that there's some sort of disaster, anytime that people do not have access to fresh, clean water. Cholera is one of the major dangers that can occur. Okay, E. coli, something that we're all very familiar with. We've worked with this in lab a lot. It is by far the most studied organism in microbiology because it is usually totally, completely harmless. E. coli is also the most prolific bacteria in our digestive tract. So by far, the most bacteria that live inside of us is E. coli. So E. coli is considered to be a harmless bacteria. The problem is there are pathogenic strains that have special types of fimbria that allow for it to attach to a host and produce toxins. So for the most part, E. coli really is totally harmless, even though it has a very, very bad reputation because, there are strains that can make us sick. But for the most part, it does not. So one type of, or one example of a disease caused by E. coli is called traveler's diarrhea. Sometimes, depending on what part of the world you're traveling to, you guys may have heard of the term Montezuma's Revenge. That's what this is, okay? So basically, if you're traveling the world and you're going to parts of the world that don't have as effective water treatments, and if you drink the water, you can get an E. coli infection that's basically a mild case of cholera or a mild case of dysentery. So they resemble two other gastrointestinal diseases, but it's not quite as bad. Okay, so it's worse than food poisoning, but it's not as bad as cholera or dysentery, and it's usually caused by E. coli. It's called traveler's diarrhea because you get it when you travel to other countries. The main thing that you need to do is just make sure that you're drinking bottled water. Sometimes when you even travel to, parts of Asia, parts of Central America or South America, they'll even tell you, like, if you take a shower, make sure you do not get any of that water in your mouth. If you brush your teeth, brush your teeth with bottled water, not the water that comes out of the faucet. It's all to prevent, getting this disease. I mean, you could get cholera like that too, but, that's, of course, much more dangerous than this is. And then enterohemorrhagic E. coli is a strain of E. coli that produces a Shiga-like toxin that can actually cause hemorrhagic colitis. So you actually are bleeding from the large intestine, and it can cause blood in the urine. So, certainly a rarer form of E. coli, but, a potentially very dangerous form of E. coli. Again, remember, even though there are bad types out there, E. coli is pretty much considered to be harmless. Okay, other types of bacterial gastroenteritis. We've got Campylobacter jejuni. That causes bad cramping and diarrhea. It gets its name, jejuni, from the jejunum, which is the largest section of the small intestine. And then it's actually associated with a type of paralysis called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which I don't know if they know the exact, causation here, but it is known to carry that complication. Yersinia enterocolytica. This is a type of gastroenteritis that's often misdiagnosed as appendicitis. So just imagine they think you have appendicitis, they take out your appendix, and you're still sick. That's not good. Clostridium perfringens we've talked about before. Clostridium perfringens is the leading cause of gangrene, but you can also get gastroenteritis. It usually occurs when animals are improperly slaughtered and parts of the intestinal tract actually come into contact with the meat. So the meat ends up contaminated basically with the animal's fecal material, and that can lead to that type of sickness. Clostridium difficile is often known as C. diff. C. diff is often a nosocomial